In America, if a bunch of Jews wanted to open a synagogue, nobody could stop them. Leading Jews began to notice already on September 11th that there were people who blamed Israel, and that people who didn't like America were the same people who didn't like Israel. Now we have again Babylonia and Jerusalem, and the best thing would be for them to compete. What's the best place for Jews to live, but also to cooperate.
My name is Gidi Greenstein, and this podcast is my platform for exploring the condition and direction of the Jewish people. Flexigidity is a word I coined by combining flexibility and rigidity to capture what I believe is the secret sauce of Jewish resilience, recurring prosperity, and permanent leadership in humanity. It is also the name of a book I published 11 years ago, with the title Flexigidity, the Secret of Jewish Adaptability and the Challenge and Opportunity Facing Israel. At the time, I observed that after decades of rising affluence and influence, the Jewish people might have passed its zenith and was entering a period of decline. Now, following the dramatic events of October 7 and Israel's war with Iran and its proxies, as well as the explosion of global anti-Semitism on the so-called October 8, it's time for a check-in. In this podcast, which I named Flexigidity, the podcast of the Hebrew man, I hope to orchestrate that discussion as someone who straddles both Israel and American Judaism. Professionally, I'm a societal entrepreneur and founder of the Reut Institute, one of Israel's most cutting-edge research, strategy, and leadership groups. I also founded Tikkun Olam Makers and spent years as a self-appointed peace diplomat. In addition, I'm a husband, father, and grandfather, and a committed long-distance runner. All of these aspects of my life will infuse this podcast. This year's July 4th will mark America's 249th birthday and the opening of its 250th year, also known as the Semi-Quincentennial, or simply SQC. This is a once-in-two-generations opportunity to reflect on the nation's past, present, and future. American Jews, too, are invited to examine our community's extraordinary journey in this country and the pivotal role we have played in its shaping. The first group of Jews arrived in New Amsterdam in 1654, 371 years ago. They have lived the American promise while contributing to it. We've built communities, fought wars, founded universities, shaped public discourse, and pioneered in the fields of justice and innovation. In return, America granted Jews freedom, safety, and opportunity. But by the late 1800s, American Jewry emerges as the great diaspora of its time. Ever since, the stature of American Jewry in world Jewry rose to become the most successful, affluent, and influential diaspora community of all times. Yet history warns us that all golden ages eventually come to an end, and all great diasporas eventually decline. Indeed, the American Jewish experience too is subject to pressures of time, assimilation, polarization, anti-Semitism, and evolving relations with Israel. And some say that the zenith of American Jewry is behind us, and its decline has begun. The question which we must all ask is, what should we do to preserve the well-being, security, and vitality of American Jewry? And to do so intelligently, we must also ask, how did we get here? To explore these themes, we are honored to host Professor Jonathan Sarna, who is the leading scholar of American Jewish history. Professor Sarna was born in 1955 and grew up in an academic household where his father, Nahum Sarna, was a distinguished biblical scholar. Jonathan earned his undergraduate degree from Brandeis and completed his PhD in history at Yale in 1979 at the age of 24. He has been teaching at Brandeis University since 1990, and in 2018, he was appointed director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. In 2004, Sarna published American Jewry, A History, which won the National Jewish Book Award and is considered a foundational text regarding American Jewry. He published additional books, including When General Grant Expelled the Jews and Lincoln and the Jews, as well as hundreds of articles. Professor Sarna now serves as chief historian at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia and has advised museums, documentary projects, and heritage initiatives. In 2004, he chaired the National Committee for the 350th anniversary of Jewish life in America, which helped establish Jewish American Heritage Month. In 2009, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and serves as the president of the Association for Jewish Studies from 2014 to 2015. Professor Sarna lives in the Boston area with his wife, Ruth Langer, a theologian and liturgist, and they are active members of the Brandeis Jewish academic community. Professor Sarna, welcome to the Flexagility podcast.
A joy really to be with you, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
I always like to begin with asking you a little bit about your youth, the legacy of your family that you came from, and what could we have seen when you were young, when you were 7, 10, 15, 17? What could we have already seen then that would have pointed to where you are today?
Well, first of all, I was the only member of my family to actually be born in the United States. My parents immigrated. Even my older brother was born abroad. So that set me apart. And I was interested in history from a young age. I actually had the opportunity to write some research papers in American Jewish history already in high school. And
Wow.
I found it compelling. And if you come from an academic family, so finding an area of study that is totally unexamined, terra incognita, as they say in Latin, unknown land, I was hooked. I knew I wanted to be an American Jewish historian when I entered Brandeis.
Wow, very interesting. So your book, let's just jump forward. Your book was described as the gold standard in the field. So I want to ask you two questions. First of all, what do you think make it so special? And the second question is, did you know it would be a groundbreaking creation when you wrote it?
Well, astonishingly, no historian had ever before written a history of American Judaism. There were journalist books, a little smart book by sociologist Nathan Glazer, but no book that had lots of footnotes and well documented. But what I think I was trying to do, and I believe it was successful, I wanted a book that would appeal to American Jews, but would also teach American Judaism to non-Jews, to general Americans, and to students of American religion. Once upon a time, all they did was study Protestantism, Catholicism. Most scholars of American religion had to read my book as their Judaism book. And then I wanted a book that could be translated into Hebrew, because it seemed to me that Israelis did not know anything about American Jewish history. Most of the great Hebrew works of Jewish history more or less ignored it, Ben Sasson and Ettinger and so on. And it seemed to me that was very unfortunate, considering that by the time I was writing, America was by far the largest diaspora community in the world. And I've really devoted my life to explaining that community, and I've tried to publish some in Hebrew so that more Israelis would also know about it, because I am deeply committed to the idea that there really today are only two great centers of Jewish life in the whole world. Obviously, Israel, but half the Jewish people, almost 45%, are now in the United States. Those two countries have to understand each other.
Exactly. And I do think, by the way, if I may, that until today, we see in Israel what I call, I may say that as an Israeli, a toxic combination of arrogance and ignorance regarding American Jewry. An American Jewish leader, in an average federation, by the time they're in their 40s or 50s, they've been to Israel dozens of times on substantive trips where they're trying to understand what's going on in Israel. The equivalent among the Israeli leadership is near zero. Yep. Most of the Israelis that come here, even as ministers, they would meet their American counterparts in government, but they would not spend time in the Jewish community to try to understand it. So that's really, I think it's really an incredibly important that we have better understanding of American Jewry in Israel.
Yeah, I completely agree. A very significant Israeli leader came to Brandeis, and I said to her what I said to you of the importance. And she said, "Ma pitom, what are you talking about? We watch it on television." And that said everything that one needed to know. Imagine only people who watch Israel on television and how little they understand it. So it's a very serious situation. And while today I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but every major university has someone who, in America, someone who teaches about Israel. There are major universities in Israel that essentially have no courses on American Jewish history.
Absolutely. I will, just before we move on, I'll say that right now there are programs that are trying to educate the Israeli serving elite about American Jewry, like Gesher and other groups who are bringing people for formative experience here, but still it's very short and it doesn't allow the time for an in-depth understanding of the marvelous creation that is American Jewry. I do want to ask you, kind of move forward in the conversation, what do you think makes the United States such a special host country for the Jews compared to Spain in the past, Germany, etc.? Why are Jews being able to thrive here in a way that is unprecedented in history?
So that actually does take us back to this great moment, and the 250th will probably extend all the way to the 250th anniversary of the Constitution in which was 1789. But here you had a country that put freedom of religion into the Constitution and then strengthened it in the Bill of Rights. Every country pretty well where Jews lived had Christian oaths back in the late 18th century. America banned that. No religious test shall ever be required for any office or public trust in the United States. So, and then Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There was nowhere with that kind of law, and Jews noticed it. Even Moses Mendelssohn noticed it. And it is very important to remember that the United States of America comes into existence just as the Pale of Settlement in Russia is being established by Catherine the Great. In other words, you have two opposite models. One claims, well, we got these Jews now in our empire, let's bar them from cities, restrict them, and force them to live in well-delimited areas. And the other said...
Anecdotally, I will say, just so the audience understands, there is a piece of legislation, a group of legislation called the May Laws, in which the Russian Federation basically regulated the Jews. There is 1,000 pages of regulation just for kind of managing the Jewish community in Russia, obviously strongly discriminating against them and so on. This is like the Russian model,
Right.
which included about 4 to 5 million Jews, right, at the Pale of Settlement.
At the Pale of Settlement, it's by far the largest Jewish community because it's Russia and Poland and so forth. And then you have this tiny America, probably didn't have more than 2,500 Jews, but is an astonishing experiment in religious liberty. And as we move into the 19th century, and we see Jews first in Central Europe, which of course is closer, but they're persecuted, and they start to come in very considerable numbers in the 1840s and 50s, and they spread out all across the country, all the way to California, which means, and this is why I wrote on Grant and Lincoln, those were people who grew up not knowing any Jews at all. If they're only Jews are 1/10 of 1% of the population, you don't know them, especially if you come from a small town. But by the time they are grown and, say, the Civil War, there are 150,000 Jews in America, all across the United States. People were meeting and experiencing Jews, and Jews were also gaining in financial power because, like immigrants, they moved in to fast-growing areas. In this case, ready-made clothing. That was a very good business. And the Civil War, in a way, put it on steroids. The Army needs tremendous amount of clothing. People get used to ready-made clothing. A little bit like what COVID did for Zoom. It speeded it up. And therefore, already by the late 1860s, after the war, you've got very wealthy Jews, and you begin to see Jews expressing deep pride in this country that has opened opportunities, and you see big synagogues, which were statements, we are here. In Cincinnati, which in the 19th century, because of its port, was a very important city. So you have 4 blocks, 4 corners, and one is City Hall, one is the big Unitarian Church, one is the big Catholic Church. And then Isaac Mayer Wise acquires the 4th and builds a huge synagogue, today known as Wise Temple, but then B'nai Jeshurun. But that's a very important statement of belonging, and we see the same thing, think Central Synagogue in New York, and people begin to take notice. There are also suddenly rabbis in America. You didn't have a rabbi in America until 1840, and it took a long time until synagogue leaders were prepared, lay leaders were prepared to say, yes, we want this rabbi Wise or Gottheil or an Orthodox rabbi, Rafal, we want them to represent us to the country at large. They all spoke, they all traveled. Suddenly, more and more people appreciate that there are Jews in America. And
so basically, the mid 19th century is a turning point.
Right.
I just want to say, having read your book, which is fascinating, and I highly recommend it. This is a war where, first time in the U.S. military, there is recognition of needs of Jewish soldiers. You speak about the first Seder that takes place in the military service. There is a first Jewish chaplain in the military.
Right.
issues relating to the stature of Jews in the military being brought up all the way to the commander-in-chief, to Lincoln, and he sanctions that they should have equal rights in the military. So we're seeing this really explosion mid-19th century. I do want to say that another element that I found very interesting in writing is that you also speak about the freedom of association and the repetitive reluctance of the courts to intervene in inner synagogue matters, basically saying this is up to the community to decide, and we, the court, we're not going to make decisions for you within the community. So basically empowering the community institutions to shape their own path.
Yeah, totally different than, say, in Eastern Europe, where the organized Jewish community, as well as the organized Orthodox Christian community, had vast power over the Jewish community, over who could marry, who could divorce, who could serve in a synagogue. None of that was true. In America, if a bunch of Jews wanted to open a synagogue, nobody could stop them. And the state is utterly uninterested. So this was a new model. Some people thought absolutely terrible. If we don't have the power of the state, Judaism will wither and disappear. But in fact, American Judaism displayed a very different model than the classic Jewish model. And over time, the traditional Jewish community, Orthodox Jews, learned how to operate with that model, absent the power of the state to back them up. Now,
eventually, actually, the Orthodoxy here created two incredible models. First is the Hasidic courts here in America and the ultra-Orthodox community that is thriving here, like perhaps we could say never before, in terms of its wealth and affluence and independence and freedom, and also modern Orthodoxy, Rabbi Soloveitchik and the thousands of students that he brought forward. So tremendous Orthodox models come from America that is so-called a secular society. I do want to go back to the mid-19th century, which is a turning point. And I think, reading your book, I would say that in the late 19th century, we begin to see American Jewry operating and thinking of itself as the great diaspora of that time. Can you walk us through the main milestones, the events that symbolize the rise of American Jewry from another Jewish community to the leading Jewish diaspora of the time, our time?
It's easy to show how quickly that happens. In the late 19th century, after pogroms in Russia, we begin, what are called in Israel, Sufot B'Negev, we begin to see mass immigration. Now, many more Jews come to America at that time than to the land of Israel, and the Jewish population of the United States, which stood at about 250,000 in 1880, is going to leap to over 3 million after World War I. So this period of mass immigration, with sometimes well over 100,000 Jews immigrating in a year, has a dramatic impact on Jewish life and on all of world Jewry, and persecuted Jews knew. Shalom Aleichem knows if there's a pogrom in Kiev, I'll go to America, which he does. And that becomes tremendously important. By the end of the 19th century, New York is the largest Jewish community in the world, overtaking Warsaw. And you begin to see the exercise of that power, just as America exercises its power on the world stage. You can certainly see it in World War I. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, that's its official name, enormous significance in all of Jewish history. It at that time, it kept alive much of world Jewry. It coordinated, and just as America saw itself saving Europe in World War One, so American Jewry feels responsible. And in subtle ways, you begin to see American Jews thinking of themselves as the great diaspora. A great diaspora needs a great Jewish culture. To have great Jewish culture, you need great libraries. 1870, you could hardly find a Shas in America. You could hardly find a set of the Talmud. But by the eve of World War II, America is by far the most important center of Jewish books. Lots of books are transferred. There's a purchase of libraries, the Jewish Theological Seminary, Hebrew Union College, Library of Congress, New York Public Library, and many more. And of course, that meant that when so much Jewish culture, so many libraries were destroyed by the Nazis, they'd already moved to America. But it was also a statement. We are going to be the great diaspora. And just as there was enormous learning in Eastern Europe, in Germany, before then in Spain, so now America.
Beautiful. So basically, what you're demonstrating is how the rise of American Jewry as the great diaspora of our time is actually corresponds with the rise of America, and we also see it in other places. The golden era in Spain corresponds to when Spain was the most powerful and influential country in the world. So you've kind of mentioned the Civil War in the 1860s, and then late 19th century, and then World War I. What are the next milestones? Because there's the Great Depression, there's the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Then we're moving forward to Second World War. What are key milestones that give us a sense of the evolution?
Well, the first milestone is a negative one. In 1924, immigration is severely limited. It drops from well over 100,000 to only a few thousand a year. And that means that America, for all of its significance, is not going to become the new homeland that will take in all Jews. And indeed, in 1925, the very next year, is the first year more Jews go to the land of Israel than come to the United States because they can't get in. That's an important moment, but it also means that the American Jewish community, which had been devoting so much of its resources simply to settling immigration and to what they called Americanization and so on, and now could use those funds in other ways. We see lots of Jewish institutions, synagogues, and the like in the late 1920s. The one that many will remember is a late one is the Yeshiva University that is opened and that is making a statement about the place of traditional Judaism. Now, obviously, the 1930s are a difficult time compared to Europe. American Jews feel very lucky, but they are also very frightened. There are anti-Semites like Father Charles Coughlin, we now know funded by Goebbels. That was believed even then, but now it's been proven. And they began to hear anti-Semitic ideas in America that they never thought would be part of America. It's not coming from the leadership, but they're much more careful and worried than they had been a few decades earlier. And that explains why, during this time of great crisis for European Jewry, most of what American Jewry did, it did very quietly. It's not that it did nothing. It did many remarkable things. Had it not been for the work of the Joint, for example, hundreds of thousands would not have survived the war. It sets up a secret effort to inform the world about Hitler, the Overseas News Agency. And it tries to bring whatever Jews it could into the United States, but the less said, the better. In other words, it understood that it wasn't the right time for Jews to be noisy. Jews participate greatly in World War II. This wonderful.
Which is a less known fact. I think, in terms of percentage per group, not just in America, also in the Soviet Union and in other countries, the number of Jewish fighters in World War II, obviously in Israel, we don't learn about that because the narratives in Israel is that Zionism invented the Jew that holds the gun and stands and fights back. But really, percentage-wise, the number of Jews that fought in the wars on behalf of the Allies is the largest compared to all other groups. It's actually incredible. There were, I think, nearly 2 million Jews who fought in the different armies during the war, which is an incredible percentage point.
Right, and about half of those are in the United States. The difference between America and Russia, I would say, is that in America they could fight as Jews. They were Jewish chaplains, which they were not in the Soviet army, naturally. They could even get kosher food, those who wanted it. And the Jewish Welfare Board is recognized by the government to help meet the needs of Jewish soldiers. It distributes prayer books and Bibles and Haggadahs and so on. And there were Jews who came out of World War II having seen, because General Eisenhower, later president, insisted that everybody who could see, they saw what the Nazis did, and that shaped them as Jews. Many of them knew if our parents hadn't brought us to America, we would be prisoners in Auschwitz. And Americans generally were repelled by what they saw the Nazis had done. And so we see in the post-World War II era a very dramatic decline in anti-Semitism, decade by decade, until 2000. Jews thought that their place was really rising in America. Jews could be now head of major banks. And, we even had a Jew who ran for vice president, Gore Lieberman. So there was a sense that nothing was beyond Jews in a free country like America. And that is certainly the moment when we begin to see Jews feel not only are they the greatest Jewish diaspora, but, most of the others are disappearing, but some of them felt we'll be the greatest diaspora the world has ever seen. And thinking about what that means. So
that's actually, but what's unique, we're hitting the late 40s by now in terms of describing the milestones, and the inflection point is the Civil War, and then the late 19th century, and then around World War I, and then the kind of the low period in the 1920s, but still the rise in influence in America. All this is happening while Zionism is growing as well, and the Jewish presence in the land of Israel is expanding. and increasingly. So initially, in the first Aliyah, which is 1882 to 1905, second Aliyah, 1905 to 1914, you really hear about Europeans, right? It comes from Russia, Romania, Eastern Europe. This is the main source. Britain. This is the main source of inspiration and of funding of the Zionist project. But beginning in the 20s and the 30s, we're beginning to see more support from American Jews. And by the late 40s, it becomes a predominant support by American Jews for the Zionist project.
Absolutely. Indeed, I would say Louis Brandeis's appointment as head of the Zionists in America, but with a very significant role in Zionism in the Allied countries, meaning not in Germany, that's also a turning point. Now, Brandeis, who is soon going to be on the Supreme Court, knew very well that America could not be a refuge for all these Jews who needed refuge in World War I. It was the greatest catastrophe the Jews had experienced to that time. And so his sense of Zionism was, we who are fortunate to have gotten to America need to do everything we can to build up a homeland for Jews who are less fortunate than we are. He did not himself imagine that he would settle in the land of Israel, but he did imagine that the land of Israel would, in a sense, be an extension of what Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time and was his good friend, wanted. It will be the American dream outward, and we will create a kind of a little America, an improved America, progressive in the land of Israel. That's why the word Commonwealth, almost no Hebrew word for Commonwealth, enters the Zionist vocabulary. And it is also important to remember that those Jews from Russia, they're the same Jews who had brothers or cousins in America. Gur al-Roi has taught us this, and that, of course, heightened the ties between America and the land of Israel. And in a way, it's still true today with so many Russian Jews since the post Soviet Russian Jews having relatives in both countries. They well understood that these are the two new centers, Promised Land and Golden Land. And
the Golden Medina.
Golden Medina, exactly. And there was a sense that Eastern Europe was declining, and of course, although it took a while for the numbers to show up today, those great centers of the late 19th century have vanished, and we see increasingly a Jewish world with two centers. It's totally consolidated, and the roots of that were in the late 19th century. And today we see that the two innovations, American Jewry, which dates back 250 years, and Zionism, which, if you like, date to Chovei Tzion or to Herzl, those become the two predominant options of Jewish life, and everything else declines.
So basically, I think that if we look at the history of the State of Israel, while compounded with, alongside the history of American Jewry, I think that there are three periods here I want to suggest to you. From 1948 until 1967, when the state of Israel is perceived to be on the verge of existence, surrounded by enemies, etc. 1967 is a total transformation. Suddenly we're confident, we're big, we won a war. Jews walk taller all over the world. And then until the 1990s, obviously the Second Lebanon War, the First Lebanon War is a point of rupture because it's a war that was contested and debated, but then comes the Oslo Accords combined with the exodus of Russian Jewry. So this is, by now we're at the top of the world, right? America is the world's sole superpower. Israel has no enemies, immediate enemies. Maybe Iran is rising in the distance as a future enemy after the Iran-Iraq war. So really, the 1990s are supposedly the best years. And then we begin to see some problems beginning to emerge and taking effect and more shape in the 2010s and 2020s. So first of all, I do want to ask you, what is, in your assessment, the role that American Jewry played in the rise of the State of Israel to this kind of affluence and power and influence that Israel has?
I mean, first of all, American Jewish financial power and political power is absolutely central to the rise of the State of Israel. Its financial power over and over again is exercised. The amount of money just in 1948 that is raised between donations and Israel bonds made a tremendous difference. But political power is also a very important. You mentioned, for example, 1967. At the outbreak of that war, someone in the State Department fed to the president, and he read it, that America is neutral in thought, word, and deed. And some leading American Jews sent a telegram that essentially said, when you come asking us for money next time, we will be neutral in thought, word, and deed. And overnight, we see Lyndon Johnson, who in his heart had been a supporter of Israel, overruling the State Department and coming out strongly. The Jewish community, similarly, it had a role in 1948 in squelching the State Department and having Harry Truman, who had once had a Jewish partner, support the Jewish state. It's not perfect, as the episode in Sinai in the 50s demonstrated, but those were two areas, and we begin to see American Jews taking enormous pride in Israel. Even before the Six-Day War, the number who had Jewish art in their homes and the number of synagogues that hosted someone and the excitement when David Ben-Gurion would come to town, that said something. And beginning in the 1960s, and again, technology matters when you could fly to Israel one stop on a jet, so it was much easier to get there. We begin to see summer programs and university programs in Israel, and that too sets the stage for 1967. And of course, 1967, which was a time when America, anti-Vietnam, and somehow a sense we can't win. And then Israel was very victorious, and everyone said, oh, maybe it will become our 51st state. Maybe it'll show us the way. And indeed, Lyndon Johnson invites Moshe Dayan, come to Vietnam and write a report on what we need to do. An astonishing moment for American Jewry, symbolically. that Israel now has that recognition as a strong country. And we know that people in the military and the Defense Department who earlier had thought, oh, Israel, it's socialist, communist, we better be careful. In 1967, they said, we trained those Israelis. We had a role. They're very proud.
Of course. And at the time, the Israel-Egypt confrontation is one of the flashpoints between East and West. American weapons and Soviet weaponry, American training and doctrine and Soviet training and doctrine. And the Israelis are winning, at least for a while, time after time after time. Eventually, obviously, the Egyptians kind of turned the table in 1973. But we see that, it becomes an essential theater for American geostrategy.
Right.
It's basically the Israeli-Egyptian conflict.
A surrogate for the Cold War. Yeah.
Yes. So basically, this is like the golden era of Israel-U.S. relations. There is an alignment of interest. There is a growing political power of American Jews affecting American policy, especially since the 1980s, following the AWACS deal, the frustration with the AWACS deal. AWACS deal was when the United States sold super high performing intelligence airplanes to Saudi Arabia, and against the objection of Israel, and nobody could, and the pro-Israel lobby could not stop the deal. It was a transformative moment. So really, it all goes to the 1990s, right? The 1990s is America is the world's superpower. Israel is in such a great place. American Jews are so proud, and there is a look. And the Soviet Union implodes, and the million Jews get out of the Soviet Union. It's really kind of the zenith, probably, of this whole relationship. But the good years continue into the 21st century. So where would you, but right now I think that a lot of people are concerned about where American Jewry is going. There's a lot of conversation on whether it's declining or not, etc. Where would you pinpoint, if you can, the moment in which this inflection point in which things began to be concerning?
So although we don't remember it today that way, leading Jews began to notice already on September 11th that there were people who blamed Israel, and that people who didn't like America were the same people who didn't like Israel. In other words, there was a growing, they call progressive, the same people who said, well, America deserved what it got, also would later say Israel deserved October 7th. It was quiet, but it's remarkable that the Jewish Federation movement secretly sets up what today is called the Secure Community Network about 2004. But it only becomes very apparent to American Jews with the rise of public anti-Semitism. First, you had Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. And then much more shocking, because Jews didn't understand what that meant. How can 6 million Jews replace 300 million Americans? But Pittsburgh, and the biggest attack ever on a synagogue in America, the most deadliest attack on a synagogue in American history, that was a shock, especially to young Jews. They had learned that attacks on synagogues, that's what happened on Kristallnacht. And suddenly it was happening there. And what I said at the time was, if we see more anti-Semitism, we will know that this is really a turning point. And that, of course, is what happened. Like the pogroms that were named for cities, you had Pittsburgh and Poway and so on, where things happened, and more, even before October 7th, the Jewish community of the United States is feeling nervous. There was great nervousness about some of Donald Trump's statements and appointments, and a new mood was afoot, and the people who believed, anti-Semitism, well, that's like anti-Mormonism and anti-Catholicism. It's history. It's finished. Realized, no, that's not the case. But of course, October 7th really confirmed that, and I think has very much transformed the mood in the American Jewish community, and questioned even what I said earlier about a Jewish power, the fact that New York can have a serious Democratic candidate who is so anti-Israel and insensitive to Jewish concerns, obviously is a statement very different than Mayor LaGuardia, who went out of his way to attract Jews.
So I just want to ask you two things to suggest, perhaps. The first is that there's been growing polarization in American politics, which also dates back to the Obama presidency, that affected the Jewish community. And because this polarization actually created tremendous strain on our institutions, and it was much more difficult to be cohesive and to speak in one voice, which I think was a very powerful undertrend also, because you're pointing the finger in the late 2010s. If you look at the late 2010s, I mean, the earlier period of the 2010s is the Obama presidency, and then the later period is the Trump presidency. So basically, around there, it's the height of polarization in American politics, and therefore in our community as well. Second thing I'd like to bring forward to point out is that effectively since the early, I would say 2000, let's say 2013 for sure, there is no signal of an Israeli-Palestinian political process toward the resolution of the process, and therefore it seems like Israel is asserting that the control over the Palestinians will be permanent. It's not a transition, it's a permanent condition, and that is also a trend or a very important factor in the evolution of American Jews and their relations for Israel. There's a question mark now.
Right. I'd like to add one other factor not enough discussed, and that is the growth of intermarriage. What we saw, and the Pew study showed it, is that in the non-Orthodox community, more than 70% of all Jews who married after 2010 married non-Jews. And, that makes a difference. And we saw that on October 7th because people's non-Jewish spouses said, well, why should I care that Jews are dying somewhere else? Do Catholics care if Catholics die in Syria? No. In other words, all that intermarriage had a vast impact, and it's easy to show if you analyze it properly that that there's now a bifurcated, just as you said, a bifurcated American Jewry. It's bifurcated on religious lines. It's bifurcated on educational lines. Once upon a time, there was a kind of baseline middle. Oh, you went 3-4 times a week to Hebrew school. There was a common knowledge. Now, you either have a very strong Jewish education in day school, or essentially you're a complete ignoramus, may not know Bible stories because you went to public or private school, but not Jewish. You had bifurcation, as I said, on marital lines, and increasingly there's bifurcation on political lines, and the bifurcation of American Jewry. So it's not one community, but really increasingly two communities is very serious. The interesting thing is that the community that is deeply Jewish, in other words, more religious, better educated, married to Jews, increasingly politically conservative, they have a lot more children than the progressives do.
Yes.
And so in 50 years, the whole picture may be different. In a free country, these kinds of changes happen. But certainly, we can now see a bifurcation that is stronger than before. And you'd have to really, I think, go back to the 1930s and all those Jewish communists in America whose history we rarely talk about, but they marched for Stalin and had summer camps and thought they were the future, to see a parallel to what we have today in some progressive circles.
So you just touched about the distant history of about 90 years ago, but when I read your book, I actually felt that a lot of the things that we're seeing now in terms of anti-Semitism from the left, anti-Semitism from the right, polarization in American society, polarization within the Jewish community, internal divisions, splits within the Jewish community, and all of that has happened multiple times in the past.
Yep.
So in many ways, there's like nothing new under the sun. So the question is, what is new? What is distinctly different now? So I'd like to go through these four mega trends, and if you can just give us like a top of mind, anti-Semitism from the left. Is it that new? What's new about anti-Semitism from the left that we're seeing now?
I think that it is more public than it was before. You certainly had anti-Semitism on the left from communists and the like, but especially since World War II, but even earlier, it seemed un-American. Whereas now, we're seeing anti-Semitism on the left that is legitimated by major political and thought figures.
And I would just say on that, before we move on, that there is the Israel component, that it's masked as anti-Israel, basically denying Israel's right to self-determination. You know, I think Mandani, the criticism against Mandani is that it rejects Israel as a Jewish state. My problem with Mandani's answer is that he rejects the self-determination of Israelis in Israel, right? Israelis can decide whether they want one state or another. Mandani is not there to share an opinion on the outcome of their deliberation. That's where it kind of crosses the line for me. The second point, I think, is that is the fact that there is what some people call erasive anti-Semitism, meaning that if you're a liberal person, and you cannot be credibly associated with the institutions of the Jewish community or with Israel and still claim to be liberal. Meaning there is a rejection of the right of self-determination of Jews in America on the left. And that, I think, these are two new things that we're seeing. What about anti-Semitism from the right? What's new about what we're seeing right now?
I think it's the resurgence of public anti-Semitism on the right. William Buckley had really stamped down anti-Semitism on the right, and many in the neoconservative community were prominently Jewish. And now what we are seeing are important right-wing forces that espouse really primitive anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and the like. The other thing that's very new and important is the digital revolution that has allowed extremists, both on the right and on the left, to find one another and to trumpet what were once far out views to a much broader community. And that's what's made it dangerous. So even though you once had those ideas, it was hard to distribute them. And there were even times when the U.S. Post Office wouldn't let you send them and disseminate them in the mail. Today, instantly, you can tell hundreds of thousands of people your ideas, and even if they are absurd, about a certain rabbi who, they're just astonishing. It's a blood libel kind of thing. You can spread those ideas very quickly, and that's new as well.
So, and I think that also, just to move to another point, because we're running out of time here, we are also saying that our community is polarized and our community is divided because we're mirroring the polarization in American society. But that happened many times in the past, right? There were periods of polarization, and then the center came back again. So I'd like to ask you again, what's unique about what we're seeing right now in your view?
We're certainly seeing a level of polarization not seen in memory. America has allowed hatred of different kinds to reemerge. There was a period when in order to fight, hatred has to be fought from the top, and that is not happening in contemporary America, although it certainly did, and that was part of the role of the president, Republican or Democrat, for a long time. But your point about I'm better at predicting the past than predicting the future, it is worth remembering that at the end of the 19th century, a country that had fought a civil war worked very hard to reunite all sorts of symbols and so on, and that could happen, I think, in the United States as well. But at the moment, what is going on feels unprecedented, and lots of things the Jews thought were settled and behind them. For example, the not only quotas, but anti-Semitic barriers preventing Jews, just because they had a Jewish name or they supported Israel, from moving forward, today are common. There are far fewer Jews at major universities. Many Jews cannot get tenure or even appointment if they support Israel. That would once have been unimaginable, and today it has become normative. So I think American Jews, most of whom don't remember unless they read a book on the subject, what it was like in the 20s and 30s, they are experiencing for the first time a level of anti-Semitism not seen in America until before World War II.
So I just want to say, we started the conversation by discussing what's unique about America. And we mentioned two things: freedom of religion, freedom of association. I'd like to throw in a third, which is the federalist structure of America. The fact that there are 50 states in the United States, and Jews that don't like New York can go to Miami. I just heard after Mandani won, someone tweeting from Miami, it's a great day. Someone tweeting from Florida, this is a great day for Miami real estate. So basically, America, because it has this decentralized structure, provides the Jewish community an insurance policy to its future that is really unprecedented in history. No time in history did we have this kind of political architecture that gives us the security and the ability to move between states. There's no one police. Nobody can weaponize the police in America against the Jews. NYPD and LAPD have different commanders. I mean, this is part of what works for us. So, and in your book, you describe a lot how the Jews are gravitating. The major centers of the Jews are gravitating from one place to another: Cincinnati, Detroit, New York, the West Coast. Now we are seeing the growth of Miami at the expense of New York. So where do you think in America is the Jewish future?
Well, the rise of Jews in southern Florida, Miami, meaning Miami, West Palm, and so on, that will soon be the second largest Jewish community, overtaking Los Angeles. And absolutely right, it is. It has a totally different feel because it is disproportionately immigrant Jews from Latin America, plus Orthodox Jews, and they are very much in concert with the governor, and the university with the largest number of Jews may already be, otherwise will soon be, the University of Florida at Gainesville. That's a huge change. We're seeing a rapid rise of other places, Atlanta, and so on. Similarly,
Texas.
in the South. Right.
Texas.
Texas is a country in itself, enormous, but Austin and around
Austin, yeah.
And that, I think, is very important. And again, digitalization matters because more and more people say, I don't have to give up my job. I can live in Florida and keep my job. I'll fly up every few days or weeks. Now, a lot of those Jews haven't lived through very serious hurricanes, and those of us who know the history of Florida know that periodically it's been set back by terribly destructive weather. God willing, that won't happen, but it's not been sufficiently thought about by some who move there. But yes, I do think we are seeing Jews move areas where they feel more comfortable, and red and blue states are a reality today of American politics, and it's worth remembering. There was a while when people said, oh, more and more Jews are moving to Florida. That'll shift it to the left. But that didn't happen at all. And indeed, today, the alignment of Jews with the political powers in Florida is very apparent. So it is worth looking internally.
Yeah, so basically, we're down in kind of the closing part of our conversation, and I want to ask you if you can imagine the greatness of American Jewry continuing. It's until 2054, when we will mark 400 years since the coming of Jews to America. What would it look like? What would be your advice to this imaginary leader of American Jewry who has the power to kind of shift resources, define priorities? What would be your advice to keep American Jewry great?
First of all, I absolutely think that conversation is the most important conversation for American Jews to have. Too much of the conversation has just been on Israel and on solving the Middle East.
And anti-Semitism.
And not nearly enough on strengthening Jewish life. The first thing I would do is build on the surge. We haven't spoken about that. But since October 7th, there have been remarkable developments, conversions to Judaism, more Jews going to synagogue, big uptick in the number of Jews in Jewish day schools and the like. And that, and all those Jews who fought anti-Semitism on universities, they're our future Jewish leaders. We ought to be cultivating and training them. They will be the leaders of the next generation, just like, by the way, anti-Semitism in the 1870s led a bunch of young Jews who continued to lead American Jewry for 70, 80 years, people like Cyrus Adler and Henrietta Zold. But so that's one thing I would do. I do think that the Jewish day school system, which in America is unbelievably expensive, needs to be strengthened. One of the reasons people move to Florida is that in Florida, tax dollars can be used, and that has kept down the price of day schools far below New York, but much more could be done and should be done. And that will have an impact. Jonathan Sachs showed in England how training more and more Jews in day schools matters, and that too will have an impact. I would, in other words, focus on the next generation. And even though we should never write Jews off, there are all sorts of examples of Jews who once we would have written off who came back, Einstein, Brandeis, and so on. Nevertheless, we should not be afraid to focus on shaping of new leaders and on cultivating the Jewish Jews. And I think in some ways they will help bring everybody up. And we should also be making it possible for those kinds of Jews to have additional children. American Jews have far fewer children than their Israeli counterparts, and there's no question that daycare and day school and university and camp costs are a major factor, and some of the money that has gone in other directions needs to come there. The best thing would be, and let me close with this, just like once you had Bavel, Yerushalayim, and they cooperated and they competed. Anyone who studies the Talmud can see that. Now we have again Babylonia and Jerusalem. And the best thing would be for them to compete. What's the best place for Jews to live? But also to cooperate and to strengthen one another. And for that to happen, each must understand the other better.
I totally agree. I do want to ask you one more question, which I think is fundamental. The big story was following Second World War is the Holocaust. So we educated our kids about the Holocaust. We educated the American society about the Holocaust. But Holocaust survivors are dying. Meanwhile, there are a lot of other people who are saying, no, we need to educate our young people about the Jewish civilization as one of the great civilizations of our time. They need to be proud of their legacy. I mean, coming to the university with the legacy of the Holocaust is like a chip on your shoulder. So a lot of American Jews, what they're proud of is Israel, as opposed to their own legacy. So my question is have we reached a point where we need to shift the meta story of American Jewry as kind of the tip of the spear of a Jewish civilization that is 3,000 years old?
I certainly think that American Jews need to learn much more about their community, and it's important to make the case that Judaism can thrive under freedom. And that's really what American Jewish history has been about. No restrictions. Jews do very well. And that legacy of freedom, the very opposite of the Russian strategy that with which we began, is, I think, one of the great lessons of 250 years. And the more people understand it, the better. And it has implications also for Israel.
It's the lessons of the 250, and it's the opportunity of the 250th anniversary to push a renewal of American Jewry in terms of its self-perception and future. 5 closing questions. What books are you reading?
These days, I'm finishing my book on Mark Twain. I've been reading Ron Chernow's huge volume. My book is on Mark Twain and the Jews. He admired Jews at a time when most people did not. And I would say when that book comes out, even though it's on the past, people will see many implications for the present.
So basically, you know, my book, Flexigidity, sorry for the plug, opens with a quote from Mark Twain, a very famous quote where he says, "All things are mortal but the Jew, all forces pass but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?"
Yeah, he doesn't answer the question. Yeah, but that's in his.
I think the question comes from Darwin.
Yeah.
The secret of Jewish immortality is not our strength and not our wisdom. It's our capacity to adapt.
Yeah.
It's the adaptability of our society. Interesting. What podcasts are you listening to?
I'm not the right
Who informs you? Who informs you?
I try. And,
who inspires you?
I read many. Jewish, like Jewish Insider and all the Jewish publications, but I read much faster than I listen. And I think I spend time reading Barry Weiss, which helps to balance the New York Times. So I read quite broadly, but no one person, and amazing how much there is out there today.
So Mike Norberger and Barry Weiss should listen to this podcast for their plug. Who inspired you, non-living, like in your past, earlier in your, like who gave you the inspiration? Who do you think is?
Well, I mean, certainly my parents, but you know, I grew up knowing the early great scholars Jewish scholars in America. I knew Saul Lieberman and Selo Baron I met and Harry Wolfson, and they would come to the house. And I know that tradition of Jewish scholarship in America and have been something, I think, of a bridge from the earliest scholars to today.
And who inspires you now? Who do you look up to in your field?
In the field of American Jewish history, I was deeply inspired by Jacob Rader Marcus, who invented the field of American Jewish history and whose capacious view, he wasn't focused just on one era, he knew it all, and he insisted criminals are part of that history as well as righteous people. So his vision is one that I think has informed the American Jewish Archives, which I'm very proud to have been associated with throughout my career. And I have now, thank God, about 40 PhDs. So I feel that has also shaped the field. And in some ways, yeah.
So, just final question: who are the future Jonathan Sarnas that we should be looking at, listening to, reading?
Yeah, I'm not going to name names because some of them. Why do I pick this student over that student? But I would say that there are today, unlike when I began. There are young Jews who care about American Jewish history and have studied it deeply. I certainly would look at some of the fast-growing institutions. I'll mention just one. Yes, he was my student, and that's Gratz College. And to see what Zev Elef, its president, whose field is American Jewish history, what he has done in a short time, and the vision he has brought to a Jewish institution that people thought wouldn't survive, and he has totally reimagined it, is to show us what could be done in other institutions.
So that's actually fascinating. You mentioned that because one of my former team members, employees, Naama Klar, was just accepted to a PhD program at the Gratz College. So here's a plug for Naama too. So Professor Sarna, I'm so happy that we are able to all benefit from your wisdom and your knowledge. And I feel we've just scrapped the surface of your insights that are so relevant for our community. I mean, if we don't know our past, we can't embrace the future. If we don't have a legacy, there's no destiny. So people like you are the bridge between the future and the past, and it's really an honor to have you here. And I hope we can have you again in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Friends, if you made it to this point, you just had the pleasure of listening to the greatest living historian of American Jewry. Professor Sarna's seminal book, American Judaism, A History, is a must-read for all of you who are passionate about or interested in the Jewish community of America. In an earlier episode, Avram Infeld framed the mission of Zionism as serving the continued and significant existence of the Jewish people. In Infeld's spirit, I argued in my book, Flexigidity, that the vibrant diaspora is a Zionist imperative, not a Zionist compromise, requiring a Bavel and Yerushalayim competing and collaborating, as Professor Sarna called for. The 250th year of America's independence begins soon and offers American Jewry a historic opportunity for renewal. My team and I are hard at work to support such renewal with an effort called L'chaim America, that calls for Jewish communities to celebrate the semi-quincentennial in a distinctly Jewish way. And on July 21, we'll be partnering with the Rabbi Sachs Legacy Fund to envision American Jewry as the great diaspora of the coming decades. You will hear much more about these initiatives in the coming weeks. And meanwhile, thank you for listening and a happy and meaningful 4th of July. That's it for today's episode of Flexigidity, the podcast of the Hebrew Man. Please share, subscribe, and stay tuned. See you next time.